We have spent January seeing how the Bible and politics are inextricably linked, and have focused so far on the prophets Amos and Jeremiah and the ministry of Jesus himself. In this final talk of the series, we are turning to the last book of the Bible. We are turning to the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. I know for some of us, the thought of a talk on Revelation will result in a sense of foreboding or even dread due to the seemingly weird, off-putting and complicated imagery the book contains, and how inaccessible and difficult it appears to be to understand. Throw politics into the mix alongside this much avoided book, and the sense of doom is most likely increasing. To reassure you, in the time we have today, we will only be able to dip into the imagery to see why it's there and how it links to our theme. And my prayer is that you will actually be inspired to go away and dig a little deeper into this book for yourselves when you see the relevance it has to world situations, both ancient and modern. The book of Revelation was written by John to testify to the vision he received from Jesus through a visitation of an angel. Tradition identifies this as John the Apostle, who was exiled on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea for his preaching of the gospel. Most biblical scholars date the book to around 95 to 96 AD, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, although a minority suggest an earlier date, during the persecution under Emperor Nero. The book is specifically addressed to 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia, or modern-day Turkey. As we will see, the early Christians of this period were under intense pressure to conform, with some succumbing to compromise, while others faced martyrdom for standing firm. John's purpose in recording the vision he has received is to encourage those who are facing persecution to endure, and reminding them of God's ultimate sovereignty. Revelation is what we call apocalyptic writing, but the understanding we generally have of that word is not true to its original meaning. I'm pretty sure that if I say to you the word apocalypse or apocalyptic, and certainly if I asked random people out and about in New Malden, the response I would get would be along the lines of the end times, the destruction of the world, how the universe will end up, annihilation, or so forth, and quite likely with a negative overtone. But the word apocalypse is actually taken directly from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means to lift the veil, a revealing of hidden truths. In other words, the revelation the title of the book describes. As we will now take a closer look at, the book of Revelation provides an apocalypse in the form of a peeling back of the facade of the Roman Empire and a divine unveiling of Jesus' true glory, God's ultimate purposes, and the spiritual realities behind worldly conflicts and power struggles. Rather than what some think of as just a weird and cryptic prediction of the future, it is actually deeply political, in fact described by several commentators as the most political book in the Bible. It provides a damning indictment of the Roman Empire, which in turn resonates with subsequent powers and regimes, but also gives us a glimpse of the final triumph over evil and offers both hope and guidance to God's followers who are facing persecution, with the encouragement of God's sovereignty and Christ's victory. To the initial readers of the book in the 1st century AD and the recipients of the letters to the churches which it contains, the fact that John is describing the Roman Empire would have been readily obvious, and we will get stuck in with some examples in just a minute. But that begs the question as to why readers since those most early Christians have focused almost solely on a spiritual, eschatological, how things will all end up interpretation, often abandoning the innate political nature of the book entirely. I was interested to read that this seems to spring from the adoption of Christianity as the Roman state religion under Constantine, when early theologians such as Augustine moved away from literal political readings to highly spiritualized ones in order to protect the church's new privileged relationship with the state. In fact, reinterpreting Revelation according to a particular agenda is a recurring theme throughout the ages, with the book being used to justify atrocities such as the Crusades, which were promoted as earthly battles which fulfilled apocalyptic prophecy. And numerous political figures or parties over the years have claimed that they are the ones able to usher in the predicted victory. And in case you're wondering why John describes his vision in such mysterious and symbolic terms in the first place, there are both genre-related and practical reasons. Revelatory apocalyptic writings were traditionally written in this way, using imagery and allegory to paint a picture of the insights and predictions being unveiled. But there was also a much more obvious and necessary reason for this coded language, as a means of safeguarding the already persecuted Christians from further danger and retribution if the Roman authorities realized that their rule and power were being critiqued, questioned, and exposed. With all that context in mind, let's use the rest of our time to dig a little deeper, focusing in particular on the two passages we heard earlier, alongside a few other key verses and ideas, in order to see the reality of Rome revealed, to contrast the crucified Christ, and to hear the call to endurance, engagement, and eternal perspective. So firstly, the reality of Rome revealed. Throughout the book, a number of codes and images are used to represent Rome, including the beast from the sea, which we heard about in our passage from chapter 13, and also the title Babylon the Great, which is envisaged as a beautiful prostitute who is the mother of the abominations of the earth. But you don't have to search very hard to work out that it is the Roman Empire being critiqued. For example, the prostitute is described as sitting on a beast with 7 heads, and chapter 17, verse 9 explains, the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Pub quiz question time. Which geographical feature is Rome famous for? Sitting on 7 hills. With reference to the 7 heads, chapter 17 continues, they are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. Many commentators see these kings initially representing significant emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian, but then also recognize a broader layer of meaning where the successive world empires are represented: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and Papal Rome. When we study the Romans in history or Latin at school, we generally focus on celebrating the civilization and innovation they introduced, with topics such as Roman roads and engineering, public baths and hygiene, medicine, underfloor heating, and all sorts of other achievements which were then largely forgotten about again in the medieval times. As someone who studied Latin for A-level and as part of my degree, and who currently teaches Latin to 2-year groups as part of my job, I'm certainly very familiar with how much there is to celebrate about the advances made by the Romans. But this is where the analogy of the prostitute entitled Babylon the Great comes in Revelation 17. Outwardly, she is beautiful, adorned in purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. As a result, the kings of the earth are said to have committed adultery with her, and the inhabitants of the earth are intoxicated with the wine she offers. But in reality, her golden cup is filled with abominable things and filth. She is the mother of abominations and is drunk on the blood of God's holy people, those who bore testimony to Jesus. A clear reference to the torture and murder of many early Christians who were martyred for their faith at the hands of Roman rule. We often say the phrase, "Don't judge a book by its cover," but we know that in reality we often get sucked in by outward appearances and promises of boons and benefits. A trivial example of this occurred to me yesterday when I was doing my shopping for this week's packed lunches, and I was trying to guess which of the ripe and ready avocados on offer was actually going to live up to that description. How often, despite outward appearances to the contrary, they are either as hard as a brick or already turned to blackened mush instead. I also feel like I have recently become a living example of this in some ways. When I went on a health kick last year, it seemed to be going remarkably well, to such an extent that friends and colleagues were coming to me for top tips on diet and lifestyle choices. But all the while, it was actually that my pancreas had decided to self-destruct, and it was type 1 diabetes doing most of the work rather than my dietary choices. Turns out I'm not a lifestyle guru after all. Who would have guessed? We can have a laugh about the false pretenses of avocados and my incredibly short-lived vocation as a health and fitness expert, but the reality of life under the Roman Empire was nothing to joke about. Let's take a closer look. Our passage from Revelation 13 started with these words: "The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea." We've already said that this beast, at least on one level, represents the Roman Empire, but we also need to understand that the dragon represents Satan or the devil, an embodiment of evil, and that the sea is also a symbol of evil, chaos, and opposition to God. John goes on to say, "The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority." Despite the evil nature of the Roman Empire beast, we are told that both the beast and the dragon are worshipped, and people wonder at the beast, asking, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The Roman Empire and the emperors themselves self-promoted in terms which resonate uncomfortably with titles and claims we, along with the first century Christians, would solely ascribe to God and Jesus. They claimed to be the bringers of peace and eternal victory, with the Pax Romana and Victoria Romana as their supposed gospel. But this was only good news to those who were willing to assimilate and compromise, as this peace and victory were achieved at any cost, with dire consequences for those who dared to stand against the expectations of the regime. The ultimate loyalty expected included religious loyalty, with the emperor himself demanding to be worshipped, assuming the titles Dominus et Deus, or Lord and God. Worship of other gods was allowed as long as sacrifices were made and hymns of honour and glory were sung to the emperor to show ultimate loyalty to him. Proclaiming Jesus is Lord was seen as a subversive political statement, and Christians who refused to participate in the imperial cult faced marginalization, imprisonment, and even death. John goes on to describe this in the next verses of chapter 13. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God, and to slander his name and his dwelling place, and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people, and to conquer them. The second half of Revelation 13, which we didn't have read, describes the second beast given authority by the first beast. There are conflicting interpretations of who or what this second beast represents, but in terms of a critique on the Roman Empire, commentators suggest the second beast might symbolize the imperial cult of emperor worship, or alternatively, the local Roman government in Asia, where the churches John is writing to were located. But irrespective of exactly who or what is being described, John's description also brings to light a further implication for the early Christians who refused to conform, which was economic exclusion. Verses 16 to 17 say, "It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast, or the number of its name." The emperor's name and face was on every coin, and Christians who refused to participate in the imperial cult were marginalized in economic terms, being rendered unable to buy and sell in the trading guilds due to their decision not to assimilate. And just as a side note, chapter 13 ends with these words, "This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the idea of 666 as a number representing Satan, but here it is actually ascribed to the beast rather than the dragon. And the point being made is that this empire and its emperors who claim to be gods are actually just men. The number of perfection and completeness in the Bible is 7, but however hard people try, or however much power they manage to achieve, they will always fall short. Hence the repeated sixes, repeatedly falling short of God's sovereignty and authority. There's much more we could study from the rest of Revelation on this topic, but we must press on, and having seen how Rome branded itself in divine terms, yet constantly fell short, it's the right moment to contrast the crucified Christ. I really struggled to decide on which passages we should have read this morning, and if time hadn't been a factor, I would have loved for us to listen to chapters 4 and 5, which are the very heart of the book. In those verses, we are transported to the throne room of heaven and the glory of the Lamb who sits on the throne. It is no coincidence that Satan and Rome are compared to a dragon and a beast, but Jesus is described as a lamb who was slain. Whereas Rome's power is asserted through violence, persecution, and land grabbing, Jesus' victory is won through vulnerability and sacrifice. And yet, in verse 12 of chapter 5, John asserts that it is Jesus, this slain lamb, who can be worshipped in the words, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise." Exactly the things the emperor expected to be ascribed. Verse 13 also asserts that this praise and worship will be forever and ever, challenging the Roman claims of eternal victory. Our second passage from chapter 19 visualised Jesus in a different way, as a rider on a white horse called Faithful and True. John says that his robe is dipped in blood, another reference to the sacrifice he has made, and that on his thigh is written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, asserting his authority over the false claims of the emperors to be Lord and God. Whatever they may claim, earthly rulers are mere parodies of the true power and sovereignty of Jesus. Another passage we didn't have time to read was Revelation 12, where John recounts the story of a woman and her child threatened by a dragon. John is purposefully echoing the Greek myth subsequently borrowed by the Romans, where Apollo, at only 4 days old, defeated the dragon Python. This myth was utilised by imperial propaganda, especially in the time of Domitian, when Revelation was most likely written, with the emperor portrayed as Apollo, a son of the gods and defeater of chaos, protecting the empire from outside forces. But John completely subverts this propaganda and asserts that the divine Son is neither Apollo or the emperor, but rather Jesus Christ, who defeated the dragon Satan and evil on the cross. And therefore it is Jesus, not Apollo or the emperor, who rescues the world from the forces of evil and chaos. Again, there is so much more we could discover and discuss, so do put aside any fear about the complexity of Revelation to dig deeper for yourselves. But for now, we must conclude by looking to the call to endurance, engagement, and eternal perspective. The last verse of our passage from Revelation 13 said, "This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people." The word patient comes from the word for suffering. So John is recognizing that the early Christians were going to have to endure and hold on to their faith in the face of trials and extremely testing circumstances. We might be fortunate to not face such directly challenging situations ourselves, but we can still end up feeling desperate at the politics we see in the world around us and the injustices being suffered by so many. The book of Revelation has both challenges and reassurances for us in the face of this. Passages in Revelation, like our second reading from chapter 19, offer much needed hope of the ultimate victory over evil won by Jesus. Although, as we look around us, it seems as though evil often triumphs, and the same must certainly have been true for the first century Christians, we can find reassurance that justice will be done and that eternal victory belongs to God rather than corrupt powers, despite the claims of Rome with its gospel of the Victoria Romana. In Revelation 13, we read that the beast was given only a finite time, 42 months, to exercise its authority, which is a reminder that the oppressive regimes of this world are temporary and limited, whereas the rule of God is everlasting and limitless. This eternal perspective should bring us hope, but shouldn't lead us to ignore the challenges going on around us. As the saying goes, don't be so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly use. So what might that mean in practice? Firstly, we should be ready to identify 21st century beasts, facing up to contemporary politics and issues with critical reflection, and through the lens of the counter-cultural sacrificial love of the Lamb. Throughout the centuries and across the world, political parties and leaders have claimed to be fulfilling God's agenda and ushering in the victory described in Revelation. And this rhetoric continues in some spheres today. But we need to realise that no politician or party will ever be fully synonymous with the kingdom of God, and as fallen and frail humans will tend towards Babylon over time. We need to resist the temptation to idolize a particular party, platform, or viewpoint, ensuring that our support or allegiance is held accountable to God and informed by his priorities and agenda. But at the same time, we shouldn't see the corruption, failure, and messiness of worldly politics as a reason to disengage and ignore the issues which surround us. Revelation should serve as a timeless reminder to call out oppressive political systems and the coercion to false worship in any era, not just ancient Rome. Historians have conjectured that the Roman hierarchical system benefited 1 to 3% of the population at the expense of the remainder, who were disadvantaged at best, or marginalised, or even persecuted at worst. If we consider current issues of social injustice, climate crisis, wars and violence, persecution, and so on, are the statistics much different? When we are amongst the small percentage not being disadvantaged, are we ready to stand up for those who are suffering, or is it easier to assimilate and avoid rocking the boat? For the first century Christians living under Roman rule, it was a clear-cut, not to mention dangerous choice between the power-hungry, self-seeking way of the beast and the dragon, or the loving, sacrificial way of the lamb. For us, it can be much more of a grey area, and we need God's help to make a stand for what is just and loving. Just this past week, at the Davos World Economic Forum, Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada and former Governor of the Bank of England, called for just such a stand. If you haven't heard his speech, I would wholeheartedly encourage you to search it up online and take a listen. Here is a snapshot of what he was encouraging. In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless, and in it he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with a greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world, unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. As we conclude our series on the Bible and politics and prepare to wrestle further with integrating our faith with our political viewpoints in our forthcoming series of talks, our challenge is to be asking God to show us the signs we need to be taking down, so that we can play our part in the change that is needed just as much in 2026 as it was in Czechoslovakia in 1978 and in the Roman Empire in the 1st century.